Welcome back to
The Voice of Nooit.
a little story of a little band that briefly existed over 4 decades ago. My name is Carl Robenheimer, and this is part 2 of that story. Once I'd been in Cape Town for a bit, I realized that actually I'd needed that break from Springs. My toxic confusion started dissipating, and I was writing songs again. My girlfriend at the time had what even in those days was a vintage Corona typewriter. I was in love with it, the sound of it, the clackety-clack of the keys, the chic swoosh of the return arm, and that snaky two-toned ribbon. It was beautiful. My working days were spent tapping rhythm on a calculator in a crowded office, bored senseless. But my nights were orchestrated by the sound of my 2 fingers on the keyboard as lyrics came tumbling out of that Corona. I'm like a typewriter. I know all the words I hear. I like to dream of fear. I wish I had the time. So when I heard that guitar strumming outside my house, I knew exactly who it was. James Phillips pitching up on my doorstep and offering me that hit was there for a reason. I reckon he'd been feeling guilty about leaving the Corporals in the lurch. And in particular, he felt guilty about how it had ended between me and him. We're a strange bunch, us humans. Sometimes it seems that we break things just so we can fix them. And we fix things just so we can break them again. We spent what was left of that night talking about what had happened with the Corporals and trying to fix what had happened between us. The next morning I called in a sickie and bunked work. The 2 of us went on a sightseeing tour of Cape Town. Our first stop was the Grand Parade, where James bought an outrageous woman's hat that he lost at our second stop, which was the dope dealer in Gympie Street. The dope dealer was a dangerous lifetime criminal named Whitey, who swaggered about with the word puss tattooed on his forehead. When Whitey expressed an interest in the hat, James gave it to him. Not without rancor, but without hesitation. 2 or 3 stopper later, the last of the brittle brutality of the Corporal's breakup had dissolved in the cheap whiskey we'd been drinking all day. Back at my place, we had a stunning jam, and we started wondering tentatively if we thought it could be possible to get a little band together, just for a jaw. James had 10 days before he had to be back at university, and I had about 20 songs. And how many did he have? And it doesn't matter. I'm sure you can come up with some ideas. And I'm sure I can find us a drummer, and I know this artist named Brett Murray, who also plays a bit of bass. And so, what do you think? I don't know, but I suppose it's possible. But we're not playing only your songs. I'll write some myself tomorrow. What do you think of the name The Illegal Gathering? In 1981, there was something called the Riotous Assemblies Act, which made it illegal for a group of 3 or more people to gather together for any purposes which could be deemed to be critical of the government or its representatives. And as we would be a gathering of 4 people armed with dangerous musical instruments and whose intentions were obviously dubious, we fitted that bill perfectly. And so we became the Illegal Gathering. The next morning, I made some surreptitious calls from the office telephone. First I phoned Brett Murray and Brian Roth, and happily they were both keen to give it a go. I made another call to a friend of mine who had a practice room equipped with some amps and a drum kit. He was a Corporal Punishment fan and had absolutely no problem with us using his room or the gear. And then all we needed was a venue for our one-off gig. There used to be a fabulous club in Long Street called 1886, which was in the basement of a building which had been built in 1886. The Corporals had played there 2 years earlier. So I called the manager, and using our status as elder statesmen of punk, we were all of 22 and 24 years old, organized that the Illegal Gathering could play there that weekend. Using the same credentials, I organized an interview with the Argus newspaper and set our publicity machine in motion. That afternoon when I got home from work, James was there, strumming his guitar, stoned out of his head, but he'd written 7 songs, even the lyrics. It had taken me 10 months to write 20, and he'd nailed 7 in a day. Bastard. The next day was a Saturday, so we packed what gear we had into my combi and headed for the rehearsal room. Brett Murray has some thoughts about this.
James is an absolute legend. I feel kind of quite blessed that I spent a few days jamming with him, working out his songs. You and James just make fucking pipes after pipes. It was amazing. And I wasn't a stoner. I mean, I tried as hard as possible to get into it, but it either made me absolutely paranoid or I just laughed and laughed and laughed until I vomited. And there was no in between. While we were practicing, we were sort of trying to get a drummer. I remember Warwick Sony.
Yeah.
I don't know what happened to him, but he didn't get the gig.
Or maybe he took one look at us and went, "Not the fuck."
I think, I wasn't going to say that, but I think that's where he fled. Yeah. And then eventually we did.
We got old Brian.
Yeah, amongst all of us, I remember he was like the corporate dude. He was the one with the proper job.
Yes, and he used to brag about how much money he was making, and then we'd say to him, "Brian, well, go and buy a drum kit then, for God's sake, then we can stop having to borrow one."
Shame, man. I really liked him.
Brian was good, eh? Brian was like Ringo. He could play something very simple if you needed it. And his enormous propensity for drugs and cigarettes and alcohol. Brian, he just went for it, eh?
Saturday arrived, along with a balmy Bergwind. And in the afternoon, we set up my PA in the 1886. We had 15 songs in our repertoire, but I don't remember much about the actual gig at all. Hopefully Brett has a slightly better recollection. Most of what I've been writing is about how cuck the band was when we played live.
I can't remember.
I can't either.
I think we were just anarchists. We just kind of made it up. I don't think I was pissed. I was too nervous to fuck things up. But I remember the drummer, and he was all over the show. He was way out of it. Can you remember anything about our one gig?
You know what? There's only one memory that I've got, and that's got nothing to do with the gig. It's got to do with the weather. I remember what a beautiful day it was. It was like, yeah, I mean, it's fucking weird.
How many songs did we play?
We played about 15 songs. They were all fucking short. They were about like a minute and a half, 2 minutes long.
Like the Ramones.
Yeah. Fabulous.
We partied like there was no tomorrow and we survived.
I wish I could remember it. Yeah.
Me too.
We must have been at least half decent, because the next day, while James was packing his bag and guitar to head back to Grahamstown, we both almost simultaneously said, "You know what, we should do this again sometime." And we decided that the sometime would be in his December break. He promised that he would write some more songs, or at least make what he had written better. And I promised that I would set everything up. The best thing about my job, apart from the weekends, was that there was a phone in the office. And as long as I was surreptitious about it, I'd be able to put it to good use. And use it I did. I phoned just about every venue in town and managed to set up a series of 6 gigs for the illegals to play over December and January. Our man with the practice room was still happy for us to use it, so I knew that by the time December trundled in, we'd be standing by like coiled springs. But as they say in the classics, not so fast, Buck Jones. Brian the drummer had obviously not had as great a time at our 1886 gig as James and I had. He told me he didn't want to play in our band anymore. And then, while I was scratching around Cape Town looking for his replacement, Brett Murray, the bassist, said the same thing. Now I had a serious problem. In pre-cell phone days, I couldn't just make a call to James and tell him, "Whoa, bro, it's starting to look like this might not be happening." And also, I'd set up all those gigs, and more than that, I really wanted to play again. And then I had a brainwave. I remembered another old school friend of ours, Dave Ledbetter, who'd also recently made the groot trek from Springs to Cape Town. Dave was a serious jazz musician, and I wasn't at all sure he'd want to come and play with a band called The Illegal Gathering. But I was out of options, and I had no choice other than to ask him. To my surprise, he was utterly keen. I guess he was missing his hometown and just wanted to hang around with some mates. And so now all we needed was a drummer, the age-old perennial problem. But the world works in strange ways. Out of the blue, I had a call from one of my new Cape Town friends, Wayne Roth, no relation to Brian, who played bass, and he'd heard that I was on the lookout for a bass guitarist. I told him we'd found one. Sorry for you. But did he know of a spare drummer lying around? His rejoinder was, "What am I, chopped liver? I play the drums." This was news to me, but in for a cent, in for a rand, I invited him around to my house for a jam, and he could play, and actually he was pretty decent at it. So suddenly our illegal gathering was back on the statute books. And then it was just a waiting game, waiting for James. Although he was generally the kind of person you could rely on to stick to his promises, he was also easily distracted, and who knew what would happen if he got a better offer on where to spend his holidays. So there I was, bated breath, hoping it wasn't all going to come to nothing. But December rolled in, and sure enough, late one night, there was that nylon string guitar strumming outside my window again. Probably the same blues strand. But now, here's the thing. I don't remember much about any of our actual gigs. And to make things worse, I haven't been able to trace a single person who remembers us playing or would admit to seeing us. I'm beginning to pick up a common thread running through this story, the vagaries of memory. I'm hoping that as I get further down the line, it'll all start coming back to me. But for the moment, you're just going to have to contend with what I can remember. I can remember that we played 6 gigs across Cape Town's Bermuda Triangle, and we must have shared those gigs with other bands because we only had 15 songs and some of them were really short. At an average length of, let's generously call it 2.5 minutes long, we certainly weren't going to be able to sustain an entire night's jol on our own. I do, however, have a vague recollection that we played with Dax Butler's band at a venue in Kommetjie called Off the Road, but the actual memory has gone, probably because James and I had eaten the inner filters of Benzodrex nasal inhalers because someone had told us they had Benzodrine soaked in them. There was also some issue with the police at the Glass Theatre, but that's about it. I decided to speak to another of my reprobate friends, Cuss Rush. Cuss had just finished writing a fantastic book about his own band experiences, also back in the early 80s. I was willing to bet he would also have had his own struggle with this memory thing. Cuss's memoir is called Between Rock and a Hard Place. You've got to read it.
You know, memory is subjective. You remember stuff, and maybe something that you told yourself or something, an idea that you want to avoid, and suddenly a memory kind of pops up, and this becomes the one that you remember, and it could be completely wrong. And you could get into trouble. And that happened to me a couple of times, but thankfully it started right in the beginning. I kind of wrote one chapter, and I sent that to Tammin. I asked her to check it out as a copywriter. And she came back with a whole bunch of suggestions saying that historically it's not correct, and this is how she remembers it. And then I thought, my God, how's that? I mean, I don't recall that at all. So then I found a whole bunch of people and double-checked with them. And it turned out that actually Tammin's memory was wrong and mine was correct. But, you know, like you say, memory is tricky, especially if you think this is now like almost 50 years later. But the good news is, Carl, that the more I wrote, the better my memory seemed to get. It was almost like I was reigniting it, and suddenly I would remember things. It's like it has a way of gestating there, and if you let it stew and stew and stew, something is going to turn, it's going to switch on. It's like a switch, and it's all going to come back to you. But I don't know
Oh
if
my
that's
God.
good news or not.
Exactly. And I keep
Yeah.
wondering that maybe I'm actually inserting memories that actually are completely and utterly incorrect. But I'm not that worried about it, you know. So let them come complain. If they can't remember or tell me now, then they can't come to me afterwards.
But also a memory, Carl, it's your memory and it's your interpretation. It is very subjective. You don't have to be objective.
There is an appalling live recording of one gig, but it seems we were more intent on tuning our guitars than playing them.
Sounds like a hosting workis on Saturday morning.
And the audience was too stupefied to realize that we hadn't played a song in 10 minutes while all that tuning business was going on. Someone call the police. There's a bunch of people on the stage impersonating a band. Where's my money? I want it back. And what about us, the band itself? Were we that narcissistic that it didn't bother us? It's no wonder I can't find anyone who remembers seeing us live. It's almost as if the gigs never happened. I'm just hoping that one day, when I'm in my bed in the oncology ward about to strum my final chord, all my previous adventures will actually flash in front of my eyes. And here's hoping that those gigs will be part of that spectacular flyby. Of course, the real bugger is that at that stage, there won't be anyone there to share it with, apart from the bored doctor who can't wait for me to get on with the job of dying so he can get off to the golf course. Everything has a season. The illegal gathering season was brief. Just 6 short weeks and then it was over. But at the end of it, we had one last thing to do before life moved on. We had to record the songs. I had a friend, Piet Marie, also from Springs, who was a bit of a wild boy. He'd somehow run into an advertising exec in a bar one night who told him that he had a problem. He'd been running a voiceover recording studio, which was becoming more of a liability than a money spinner, and he didn't know what to do with it. Pitt, however, knew exactly what to do with it. He had this contact, me, who was highly connected in the music industry, and he was sure he could persuade him, me, to take it over. You never know. Maybe he, me, could make something of it. Pitt told me about the place, and the two of us went over to have a look. It was on the 3rd floor of what used to be called the Broadway building in the foreshore. And it was stunning. It had a separate control room with double-glazed windows and a soundproofed recording room bigger than my house. The control room had a 16-channel mixing desk, and in a cupboard beneath it we found a suitcase full of microphones. It was perfect, except for one little thing. There was no tape recorder. But actually, even that wasn't a problem. A few months earlier, I'd bought something called a Porter Studio, which was essentially a redesigned cassette tape recorder. But whereas a conventional cassette deck would record onto 2 tracks on one side of a cassette, and you'd have to flip that thing over to record on the other side, the Porter Studio used the full width of the tape in one pass, and that gave you 4 tracks to record on, either simultaneously or individually. Willem Muller is a recording engineer, and he's encumbered with the burden of knowing a lot about a little of the arcane aspects of the old recording machines. I had a chat with him and Jonathan Handley about the Porter Studio.
It was the first thing like that, that people could actually have some kind of affordable multi-track thing at home. Record bass, drums, guitar, bounce it to one track, and then add vocals and other stuff.
I was wildly excited about that format at the time because here now we've got a studio, we can make our own demos, we can make our own albums.
And Chris Quirk is a Cape Town musician who's also had the misfortune of having to deal with professional studios.
There'd been bands that really were great songwriters and they'd just disappear and their music would be lost. You've got a disinterested technical guy who leaves the mixer knobs where they were when the gospel band had just walked out, and now he's recording a punk band with the same settings. And I thought, I would rather get 95% out of 5% of the gear by owning it, learning it, living with it, and squeezing it as hard as I could, than the opposite, where you have 90% of the gear that you need, but you get 5% of the quality because the people who are behind the knobs aren't really that interested or don't really know where you're at.
I think it's a fantastic format. If you overload the signal, it compresses it and distorts it slightly, and it gives it a real kick-ass sound. and it used DBX noise reduction, so there wasn't much tape hiss, and you could work very quickly. It was very simple and quick. I wish we could have something like it today.
The trouble with the Porter stereo is because they're 4 tracks, you're forced to bounce things down and you lose your stereo image, and you couldn't remix anything. So if you had your bass drum and your bass guitar out of balance at the beginning, and you put 7 layers of overdubs on top, and you realize that I can't hear the bass drum anymore, or worse, I can't hear the bass guitar anymore, well, you got to pull the whole thing down and build it up again. So you tend to sound check, fiddle the knobs. You do the best you can with what you have.
Much of the Beatles' classic repertoire was recorded on 4-track. They would also bounce, but not onto a track on the same machine, but onto another machine. So they could record on 4 tracks and then bounce it onto a track on a different machine and then continue there and maybe go back again. However, what they used was 1-inch tape for 4 tracks. So that's 1/4 of an inch per track. A cassette is only 1/8 of an inch, and there's 4 tracks on it. So that's a 32nd of an inch per track, like a hair, you know. What determines how good a tape recorder sound is the width per track and the speed it runs at. So in both of those things, the Beatles stuff was like 100 times better.
So that was the overall aspect of how things were done in the pre-digital era, when everything had to be done the hard way.
And that brings us to the end of part 2. This is
The Voice of Nooit.
a little story of a little band that briefly existed over 4 decades ago. Stay tuned for more of The Voice of Nooit, coming soon to a theatre near you.